When we're doing conditioning, we're only focusing on conditioning. When we're focusing on strength, it's only a strength session. We're working.
Those two right there.
Those are my favorite.
Take away a lot of muscle groups that you need to stabilize.
You're spending a lot of time in these, you can actually improve this.
All of them.
Right? All right, guys, welcome. We are here talking about the principles of what we believe in for strong bull programming. Rob up here has decorated this amazing board with the quality of life circle. And Rob, talk a little bit about what you believe in with these 6 principles and movements.
Yeah, so on this quality of life circle, we use the 6 fundamental movement patterns. That is kind of universally thought of most strength coaches. These are the most important movements to concentrate on. And then everything kind of plays off of that. So the first thing we look at, and these are all familiar movements to most people that are in the industry, you got the squat, you got the hinge, which is the bend pattern, the carry, then we have the pull, which is vertical and horizontal, the press, vertical, horizontal, and then you have the lunge. These are the staple of most of our programs, and then we kind of venture out from there, and then you get into the jumping, throwing, rotational. But these is what you want to build upon on and start to strengthen. Spend most of the time in here. So when we go into this, we go ahead and we start with it and we build upon with progressions. So when me and Dom, when we go and we work on it, we look and to see how much of there's in there. Once we get into that, that's the foundation as far as movement patterns. Now,
what most people, you can attest to this, what they do is they fill in these gaps, right? And they think that that's what the program is all about, or that's how you should strength train. But like Rob said, these are all correlations of the movements that you should stand for before you start venturing out, before you start getting into these crazy things you see on Instagram or social media. So what we've built was making these programs our foundation, and then from here we're able to add in some of these different variations of a lunge, different variations of a squat, your hinge, your carry. Because in order to do these movements or to do the variations that you see, you got to master these or have some type of base before you move on from there.
And the reason why I call it the quality of life circle is if you have to regress these movements too much, then you lose your quality of life. If you cannot put your hand over your head and be able to put something up, then you need an assistant or assistants stepped on something to do that. If you cannot sit down and stand up on your own, then you either need to assist yourself or use someone or some object to assist you. So you're always trying to build upon these so that doesn't happen. Now, the squat and the lunge are related because it's basically a one-legged squat, and the hinge and the carry are related. So those are related, but all these movements are components that help your quality of life. And if you're missing one of them, that's where you kind of pay most of attention to try to get it as further ahead as you can. Then we get into other movements. And just like Dom said, then you can either regress them or progress them, but you're trying to always make the circle bigger.
Yeah, and to kind of go there for the next point, we'll talk about the repeated bout effect. Sports that we talk about a lot, which is CrossFit, they spend a lot of time in one or two of these, and then they forget about the rest. What that happens is you get in that repeated bout effect where they're doing the same thing over and over again, the same motion over and over again. So what we try to do, right, is spend multiple time in each one of these movements so that we can become the master of all 6, so therefore we can become the master of many, right?
Yep.
So
I'll go like over each one of them. We're gonna like put a lot of time. So it could be any programs. I see it a lot. Repeated bout effect. So what it means is you're repeating something over and over, and you're able to progress it. And when you do that, would say every Monday's back squats 5x5, and I started out 50%. The next week I went to 60% to 70%, and then I moved to 5x3s. It's called the repeated bout effect. So your body, the first time when you hit it, you get a little sore, but it starts to basically acclimate to it, and then you start adapting. So that's you build upon it until eventually you get as much as you can out of it. What happens with a lot of times is you start to see people move that around. So they don't get the repeated bout effect. And so then squats one day, 2 weeks later, another squat. Not that it never works, but it is less than ideal to see progression.
Yeah, random results from random training is basically what we're trying to say.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so then we go into the interference effect. This is the one me and Dom are going to kind of like hit
spend
home.
a lot of time on that. We actually just had a conversation with some people from High Rocks talking about their way of training. They basically told us in a nutshell what they do in a week. Me and Rob looked at each other and kind of like smiled, like, okay, this is exactly what we talked about with the interference effect. Like the example would be like running 7 miles directly into a leg day, right? You're kind of getting that interference because your body's sending signals to build aerobic capacity or build aerobic base. And then you're also coming back at it with a strength component too. Like the body's like, all right, now I need to get stronger. You get into that position where we said like you lose about 10%.
You can lose good percentages. It depends on how close it is.
How close they are together, which meaning that you're basically getting nothing out of all the work that you put in. So what we try to do in our staple of our programming is putting these and avoiding the interference effect and putting domains in basically buckets that they should be in. So when we're doing conditioning, we're only focusing on conditioning. When we're focusing on strength, it's only a strength session. We're working on midline, it's only a midline section, because we're trying to put as much as we can into one bucket to fill it up.
Yeah, so the interference effect, this is a big one. This is the principle that everybody doesn't pay attention to. And in certain programs are worse than others, obviously. So in the interference effect, what happens is you're putting two different types of adaptation together too close, too intensely, and you disrupt the adaptation. So you end up getting little bits of each one instead of separating it. Now, it can be done, but it has to be separated by a lot of time. So we program to minimize the interference effect. So when we put out program, we're looking for ways to make it as far as the best.
Optimal.
Yeah, the most optimal.
Optimal.
And so when you stay away from this, that's when you see a good effect and an adaptation with that.
And quick results too.
Yeah. So the funny thing about having good programming is the results.
Yeah.
And you see the results with less work, and that's what you're optimally trying to do.
Well, that's kind of what we talked about. Like less is more. Has never been said more about efficient programming.
Yeah.
If you can do less and get more from it in an efficient program, which is what
effective programming.
Yeah.
The funny thing about effective programming is you have to do less because it's more effective instead of wasting a lot of time out there doing more. And that's like the definition of like effective programming is the opposite of diminished returns. And when I see a lot of programs, you end up getting diminished returns. You end up doing more work and getting less from it.
Which means you put in more work because you're like, well, I'm not getting what I want fast enough. I have to add more to it. So you just continue to double down on that same effect of diminishing returns.
And an example of an interference effect, and this is very classic, you're within a group setting or you're training within an hour. You have 5x5 back squats, cleans, or whatever it is. You're working on some kind of strength, and then you're going into some intense metabolic condition, a Metcon or whatever. That's going to interfere through both of them, physiologically and not only psychologically, both of it.
Yeah.
They're both going to do it. Now, the opposite way is you could start out with a conditioning, and then you go into the strength. It's still going to interfere. The only way you could do that is it's separated by long periods of time, which when you're working with general population or athletes that don't want to commit hours on end in a gym, that's just ineffective if you're doing that.
Yeah.
So then we move on and we go to exercise pairing. So exercise pairing is how you put exercises together in workouts. And when we go and we're looking at exercise pairing, a lot of times we're trying to prevent any kind of mechanical fatigue that can cause issues with some muscle groups that you need to stabilize big movements.
Yeah, example here, squat, lunge. This is a single leg squat. We talked about that earlier. A lot of times you'll see in programming, people will do this in the beginning of the workout, midway through the workout, and at the end of the workout. And then the next day, they'll do that. And what we're talking about is exercise pairing. So if I'm in a position where I can squat on Monday, I shouldn't be squatting again until Thursday, Friday.
You need a couple days, Lisa,
in between that, because I want to recover from the taxing squats that I did here. Even if I don't go high percentage, I want to make sure I'm not repeating the same movement patterns. There's nothing wrong with doing a squat here, adding in a pull, adding in a press, and using that almost like a total body day. Even if you break it up within your total body day, separating the two movements, again, exercise pairing, is where you see great results. It's where you don't see that diminishing return, that interference effect as well, and some of the exercise programming or exercise pairing that you do.
Correct. So I'm gonna give a real bad culprit that you see all the time.
Yeah,
so
I already know
you squat.
Yeah.
And then you're using your lower back, and then all of a sudden you're hinging. Those two right there.
Those are my favorite.
Take away a lot of muscle groups that you need to stabilize.
Yeah.
You go and you put them together, you're going to run into problems. Now, I'm not saying you don't do squatting and then there's some form of accessory hinge.
Yeah.
But you do not, for general population especially, want to squat and then all of a sudden have a heavy hinge within that same session or a day after.
Absolutely.
You need some in between. If you just follow some of these principles, you would mitigate some of the issues you see. It's really simple. The biggest thing I see is what you end up doing and running into these problems is because you're following some kind of methodology or whatever program that has blinders on. And when you have those blinders on, they give you blind spots to programming when you're writing it. You're trying to always fit in this box instead of being open-minded and be able to move things around.
Yeah, and even that, also if you're, what I call like your Instagram picking, you're going on Instagram and you're watching videos of some of the people posting stuff and you're seeing them do a squat and then you see them do a lunge or a hinge, and then you're like, I want to do that. And you're just going to pick and choose what you do. That's why it's so important to follow programs like Strongbow that tell you exactly where to implement some of these movements for your exercise parent. We do the hard work for you so that when you show up to the gym, you just open up the book, and this is where you go and you look and see how things are implemented and see how we mastermind some of these programs so that you don't have to go guess and guess where you put these exercises at today.
Yeah, and I'm not saying you never challenge yourself.
No.
But that should be minimally programmed in there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that should be something you run into all the time where you're fatiguing the lower back. That's one of the lower back and the shoulders are two that I pay the most attention to. And then that brings us into inappropriate volume.
Yeah.
It's just how much, at what weights and what loads and how often are you doing it. So you start going heavy, you got to be careful. You start hinging a lot, you got to be careful what you're pulling off the ground and what you're squatting. So that's because the lower back is being taxed.
Yeah.
What kettlebell swings are you doing? Any kind of Olympic lifts? You start adding that stuff in. This will take away if this is heavy. That's why you want to kind of mitigate that. The inappropriate volume, when you start doing volume and you start going to higher levels, it's just going to be taxing.
Yeah. It's
going to sit around the individual for a long period of time. So then you're not going to be able to use those same muscle group patterns for days at a time.
And even that, when you're programming inappropriate volume, in your head, you don't see it because you're writing it so far in advance, which is fine, right?
Yeah.
But making no modifications or no adjustments along the way. If I'm doing 100 reps of a squat and I think, if I do 5x5, that's 25 reps, then look at my accessory work and I'm doing 3x10s and on each leg and stuff like that, you're doing an excessive amount of volume. And then you turn around and do a lunge a day or two later with 100 something reps. The volume is so crazy, so you're never actually getting the results you want because you're never actually recovering from the volume that you've programmed for yourself. So what me and Rob talk about a lot is like starting with the amount of volume you'd like to seek and then sprinkle that throughout your programming with your sets and your reps. And there's nothing wrong with doing 5x5s or doing 4x5s and breaking them up. But when you get into these 3x12s and 3x15s each side, you're getting a crazy amount of volume and you're never ever going to recover.
Yeah, and if you're doing higher volume workouts, which I'm going into there, you need to build upon
the repeated bout effect, yeah.
To be able to get in there to handle that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So some of these are related if you're kind of paying attention to bringing them together.
Yeah.
So this will be like for a lot of people that do mixed modality and CrossFit. So if we did, in a level 1, they have it's 21:59 of thrusters and bar facing burpees. It's like a 3-minute to 4-minute workout for fast people, 2 minutes even faster. If I went ahead and did 3 sets of 12 or 4 sets of 12 of thrusters with 2-minute rests, and then with the burpees, you wouldn't be sore at all. But I wouldn't have to do that, and you do that really quick and intense, you're going to be really sore. So you got to pay attention to how the volume is delivered too. If the volume is delivered with way too high intensity, then your tissues are going to have issues.
Yeah.
So that's the issue with having Metcons every day. They're really potent. And I know it sounds like because they're so potent, it makes a lot of sense. Mm-hmm. But what they end up doing is giving you diminished returns and taking away.
Yeah, well, it's extremely, it's all of us have done CrossFit to some degree. Yeah. It's very addicting to get that high of getting up here, right? But when you stay up here, like you said, you before you know it, you're starting to do this slight decline because of the amount of excessive volume that you have. But when you're in a position where you can kind of be up here, be down here in an appropriate way, you can go back up and revisit those high intensity.
Yeah, and I like CrossFit, but if more of their programs would pay attention to some of these, that would make those programs a lot better.
Oh,
and then
you'd be able to do them forever.
Yeah, definitely. You just pay attention. Now, if you're stuck in that box, then you have the blinders on, then you're going to run into issues. But now we go into too many variables, and this is what you see when there's too much focus. And I call it like the pie in the sky. You're always kind of chasing all these movements, but none of them are really going to give you as much adaptation and what you're looking for as the big compound fundamental movements. Yeah. A lot of times you end up wasting time on things that really don't matter to everyday life or transfer over really well to other athletics. Yeah. So we choose to spend most of our time to things that are going to transfer over to other movements easily.
Yeah, and again, we're talking about general population here, right?
Yeah.
Which is the majority of those of you like in this position is general pop, is spending time in these, right? Majority of the time. Yeah, you can venture out into some rotation or some other variables of training, but when you have too many of them, like you're saying, you never actually yield results. You never actually progress in anything.
Yeah.
Because you have your hand in everything. So,
well, you're spending so much time. So most of the time spent here, then you start getting into some of the jumping, throwing, and rotational. But that's not the base of the program unless you're specializing to try to do that with some athletes.
Well, you can even argue that spending a lot of time in these, you can actually improve this.
All of them.
Right? This different venture that you go into.
That's the thing about effective program. It's kind of funny. The better you move in knees, the easier it is to teach you all other complex movements.
Yeah.
And it's like really simple.
Absolutely.
But the worse you move in knees, the harder it is because then you're pushing up against a wall basically.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's concentrate on knees the most. Everything else will come easier. And that's kind of like what we go for in the principles that we use.
Yeah, guys. So there it is. We talked a lot about the principles that we use. Rob came up with this amazing quality of life circle. So you guys have any more questions as far as what we talked about? We're going to spend a lot more time talking about these and even giving some examples of what we want here in Strong Boom.